Some men are taught to look down, and some are taught not to look at all. Edward Hale had been raised in the second tradition. He had inherited a great deal of money and the careful blandness that often comes packaged with it, the ability to move through a room full of people who served him without ever quite registering that they were there. For 65 years it had cost him nothing. On a quiet Tuesday evening, in a restaurant his family had owned for 3 generations, a 7-year-old girl was about to show him exactly what it had cost everyone else. The Hale family had a saying, passed down like the silver and the cufflinks, a gentleman never notices the help, because to notice them would be to embarrass them. Edward had been raised to believe this was a kind of courtesy, a discretion, even a form of respect. It had taken him 65 years and a child in a yellow dress to understand that it was nothing of the sort. It was a permission. A beautifully worded permission to look straight through the people who carried your plate, refilled your glass, and went home to lives you would never have to imagine. His whole family had mistaken not seeing for good manners. The bill for that mistake had been paid, quietly, for 3 generations, by people whose names no Hale had ever bothered to learn. "Excuse me, sir. Can I take these 2 pieces of chicken home?" Edward looked down, and then further down, because the voice had come from somewhere near his elbow and the speaker was very small. A little girl stood beside his table, no higher than his shoulder where he sat. She was perhaps 7 years old. She wore a party dress that had clearly been chosen with great care for an occasion, a slightly faded yellow dress with a bow at the waist, and her hair had been done in careful twists with small beads at the ends that clicked softly when she moved. She was holding something behind her back with both hands. And she was looking at his plate, at the 2 pieces of fried chicken he had pushed aside, golden and untouched, with an intensity that did not match a simple hungry child. The restaurant was called the Rosewood Grill, and it had been the jewel of the Hale family. Holdings for as long as Edward had been alive. Dark wood, soft leather, a fireplace at one end, the kind of place where deals were closed and anniversaries were marked. The waiters knew the regulars by name and the wine list by heart. It was not a place where one expected to find a child in a party dress, alone, holding something behind her back. Before Edward could answer, a man in a charcoal suit appeared as if from nowhere. "I am so terribly sorry, Mr. Let me remove her at once." The name tag read Howard Pell, general manager, and his smile was the smooth, untroubled smile of a man who had spent years making unpleasant things disappear before they reached the people who mattered. He reached for the girl's arm. "Come along now. You can't be out here. You know that." "Don't," Edward said. It was a single word, said quietly, but it stopped the manager's hand in the air. Edward was a man who rarely raised his voice, because men in his position never have to. The room arranges itself around their preferences before they finish expressing them. He found, however, that he did not want this particular arrangement. There was something about the child holding something behind her back that he wanted to understand before it was taken away. "She asked me a question," Edward said. "I'd like to answer it myself, if you don't mind." "Step back." Howard Pell stepped back, the smile straining. Edward turned to the girl. "Now. What's your name?" "Sora," she said. She had the grave dignity that some small children carry, a seriousness all out of proportion to her size. "Zora Mills. And you'd like to take these 2 pieces of chicken home?" "Yes, sir." "If you're done with them. They're going to get thrown out otherwise, and that would be a waste, and today is a special day so it shouldn't be wasted." The words came out in a careful rush, clearly rehearsed, clearly important. "A special day," Edward repeated. "Why is today special, Sora?" And then the girl brought her hands out from behind her back, and Edward saw what she had been holding, and the sight of it would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was a card. A homemade birthday card, folded from a single sheet of paper, decorated in crayon with a lopsided cake and a great many hearts, and across the front, in the painstaking capital letters of a child just learning to write, it said, "Happy birthday, Mommy." "It's my mommy's birthday," Zora said. "She works here," says a waitress. "She's working right now, but it's her birthday, and I made her a card, and I wanted to give her something special, because she always says fancy food is for special days." She looked at the chicken, and her voice dropped, suddenly shy. "This is the fanciest food I ever saw. So I thought, if nobody wanted it, I could take it home and we could have a fancy birthday dinner. Used me and her. Ide let her have the bigger piece. A pause. It's her birthday, so she should get the bigger piece." The dining room did not go silent so much as the air around the table seemed to thicken. Edward Hale, who had been to 1,000 birthday dinners in rooms exactly like this one, dinners that cost more than this child's mother likely made in a month, sat holding the gaze of a 7-year-old in a faded yellow party dress, who had dressed up for a celebration whose entire menu was going to be 2 pieces of chicken from a stranger's discarded plate, and he discovered that he had completely lost the thread of whatever he had been thinking about a moment before. "Your mother is working tonight," Edward said. "On her own birthday." "She works every night," Zora said simply. "She says birthdays don't pay the rent." She delivered this borrowed wisdom with a small frown, clearly repeating a thing she had heard and not fully understood. "But I think birthdays should still be nice. Even if they don't pay the rent. Don't you think so, sir?" "Yes," Edward said, and his voice was not quite his own. "I think birthdays should be nice." He looked up at Howard Pell. "Bring me the child's mother." The manager's smile finally collapsed. "Sir, she's in the middle of a service, the section is full, I really don't think, I didn't ask what you think. The girl's mother is a waitress in this restaurant, on her birthday, and I would like to meet her. Go and get her." There was a beat in which Howard Pell calculated, visibly, whether the man who owned the building was serious, and concluded that he was, and went. The mother's name was Renee Mills, and she came to the table still carrying her order pad, with the slightly panicked composure of a woman who has been pulled off the floor and does not yet know why. She was young, younger than Edward expected, and she was thin in the way of people who give the larger piece away as a habit, and when she saw her daughter standing at a guest's table holding a crayon card, every drop of color drained from her face. "Zora." Her voice was tied with fear. "Baby, what are you doing?" "I am so sorry, sir, she was supposed to stay in the break room, I'll take her right now." She reached for the child. "I'm so sorry, Mrl. It won't happen again, please, Ms. Mills," Edward said. "Please. Stop. Your daughter has done nothing wrong, and nothing is going to happen to you. I promise you that." Renee Mills froze, half bent toward her child, and Edward saw in her face the particular terror of a person for whom this job is the only thing standing between her family and the street. It was the terror of someone who cannot afford even a small mistake, watching her child make what she assumed was a large one. "Your daughter asked me for the food I was about to leave on my plate," Edward said. "She told me it's your birthday. She made you this." He gestured to the card in Zora's hands. "And she wanted to bring you a special dinner, because she said fancy food is for special days, and this was the fanciest food she'd ever seen." Renee Mills looked at her daughter, and at the crayon card with its lopsided cake, and something happened in her face that was almost worse than the fear. Her chin began to tremble. She had been holding herself together through a long shift on her own birthday, and a 7-year-old's homemade card had found the one crack in the wall. "Oh, baby," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." "It's your birthday," Zora said, as if that settled everything. And to her, it did. Edward sat with this for a moment. Then he asked the question that turned the evening from a tender moment into a reckoning. "Ms. Mills. Is it? May I ask you something? How long have you worked here?" 2 years, sir." "And on a birthday, on any normal week, could you afford to take your daughter out for a nice dinner?" "Not here. Anywhere. A modest place." "Could you afford it?" Renee Mills hesitated, and the hesitation was its own answer, but Edward waited, and at last she said, quietly, "No, sir. Not really. Not most weeks." "You're a waitress in one of the finest restaurants in this city," Edward said. "You handle hundreds of dollars of food and wine every night. And you can't afford to take your own daughter out for her mother's birthday. Let that sit. Help me understand that. Because the arithmetic doesn't work, and I've spent my whole life trusting arithmetic. And here, something shifted in Renee Mills. The fear was still there, but underneath it, for just a moment, surfaced something she had clearly kept buried for a long time. A weariness, and beneath the weariness, an old and carefully managed anger. The arithmetic works fine, Sir, she said. It just doesn't work for me. It works for the restaurant. Explain it to me. She glanced at Howard Pell, and Edward saw the flicker of fear return, and he understood at once that whatever she was about to say, she expected to be punished for it. She has nothing to fear from him, Edward said. He no longer has any authority over your employment. I'm giving you my word as the owner of this building. Tell me. Renee took a breath. It's the deductions, Sir, she said. The wage is the wage, it's not much but it's legal, and the tips would be enough, the tips are good here. But we never see the tips whole. There's the tip out. We have to tip out a percentage to the managers, the hosts, the bar, the kitchen, and the percentage keeps going up, and somehow the managers' share is the biggest. Then there's the deductions on top. We pay for our uniforms. We pay for a training fee, every year, the same training. We pay a fee for the point-of-sale system we ring orders on. Her voice was steady now, the steadiness of someone reciting a thing she has gone over 1,000 times in the dark. And then there's the walkouts. If a table leaves without paying, that's on the server. It comes out of my check. Last month a party of 6 ran out on a $400 bill while I was in the kitchen, and $400 came out of my pay, like I was the one who stole it. She looked at him, and there was no self-pity in it, only a flat, exhausted honesty. By the time all of it comes out, Sir, a good night isn't a good night anymore. So no, I can't take my daughter to dinner on my birthday. I can barely make the rent. And my little girl noticed, because little girls notice everything, and she decided to bring me a fancy dinner from a rich man's leftover plate, because that's the only way she could think of to give her mama something nice. Her voice finally cracked. And I am so proud of her, and so ashamed that she had to, and I don't know which feeling is going to win. The dining room had gone completely still. Even the fire in the great fireplace seemed to have quieted. And then, slowly, the rest of the room found its voice. A young server near the bar set down her tray. A table walked out on me in October, she said. $200. It just started. It wiped out a whole shift. I cried in the walk-in cooler where nobody could hear me, and then I came back out and smiled and refilled water glasses, because that's the job. An older waiter, silver-haired and dignified, spoke without raising his voice. I tip out more to the managers in a week than I pay for my own groceries, he said. I did the math once. I wished I hadn't. So many things are easier to carry when you don't know the exact weight. Abu's boy, barely 16, stepped forward with his hands shaking. They take a fee out of my check for the computer I ring orders into, he said. I never understood that. He asked. They told me everybody pays it. So I stopped asking, because I needed the job. One after another they spoke, and the elegant room, with its dark wood and its firelight, revealed the quiet arithmetic of suffering that had been running beneath its polished surface all along. Renee Mills looked around at her co-workers, at all of them finally saying out loud. The thing each had carried alone, and she reached down and pulled her daughter against her side, as if to shield the child from the weight of it, or perhaps to draw a little strength from the small warm body that had started all of this with a crayon card. Edward Hale turned to Howard Pell, and his voice, when it came, was very soft and very cold. Is this true? They tip out to managers. They walk out charges. I love it. Sir, these are standard practices, they're industry standard, every restaurant, charging a server $400 because a table she was not watching ran out on its bill. Is that standard? Sir, the policy is designed to incentivize attentiveness, it is designed, Edward said, to make a waitress personally responsible for a theft committed by a customer, by deducting it from wages she has already earned. That is not a policy. That is robbery with paperwork. Es truth. And the managers, tip out. You take a cut of these people's tips, and you've structured it so your cut is the largest. Whose decision was that? Hardworking said nothing. His silence was a confession. Because the Rosewood Grill belonged to Edward Hale. It had belonged to his father, and his father's father, and it had passed to Edward along with a portfolio of other holdings he managed at a great and comfortable distance, through managers who reported to executives who reported to a family office that sent Edward a single tidy summary each quarter. He had not personally examined the operations of the Rosewood Grill in 20 years. He came here to dine, not to manage. He had trusted that a restaurant his family had built its name on was being run with the dignity the name implied. He had been wrong, and the proof of how wrong was standing in front of him, thin and trembling, holding a crayon card on her own birthday. Sal, Edward said. A man rose from a small table near the door where he had been quietly eating alone. Sal Moretti was 68 years old and had been Edward Hale's driver for 20 years. He was a broad, weathered man with a working man's hands and a face that had seen a great deal and judged most of it silently. Edward had brought him in for dinner. Tonight, as he occasionally did, a habit that the rest of the Hale family found eccentric. Sal had been watching the whole thing from the corner, saying nothing, the way he always said nothing. Sal, Edward said again. You've worked for me 20 years. Jube never once told me I was wrong about anything. He always assumed that was respect. I'm beginning to think it might have been something else. So I'm asking you directly, as a man who has spent his life on the other side of this, the side that serves. Tell me the truth. Am I the only one in this room who didn't know this was happening? Sal Moretti looked at his employer for a long moment. Then he spoke, in a low, even voice, and what he said landed harder than anything else that evening. Reale, he said. I've driven you to this restaurant maybe 200 times. And every one of those times, while you ate in here, I sat in the car, or I ate in the back with the staff if they were kind enough to ask me. And the staff in the back of every fine place I've ever waited in, they all tell the same story. The deductions. The walkouts. The tip-out that flows uphill. It's not a secret, sir. It's just told quietly, in the back, by people who can't afford to say it out loud in the front. It paused. You asked if you're the only one who didn't know. No, sir. You're not the only one. But you're the only one in this room who had the power to stop it and didn't. And that's a different thing than not knowing. That's not looking. That is 20 years I should have said that to you. I'm saying it now. Edward Hale received this in silence. It was, he would reflect later, the most valuable thing anyone had ever said to him, and he had paid the man who said it a driver's wage for 20 years to keep it to himself. Thank you, Sal, he said. You should have said it sooner. And I should have asked sooner. We've both been quiet too long. He turned back to the room. Howard Pell, you're finished. Effective immediately. You will not touch a record, a schedule, or a ledger before you leave this building. My attorneys and my own. People will be here within the hour, and every document connected to tip-outs, deductions, walkout charges, and fees is to be preserved exactly as it stands. If a single file is altered, or one employee is told to keep quiet about tonight, I will know, and I will spend whatever it takes to make sure you regret it. Now go. Howard Pell went. Then Edward Hale did something the staff of the Rosewood Grill would talk about for years. He turned to the kitchen, where the cook had appeared in the doorway, and he said, I want your finest birthday dinner prepared. Everything. The chicken, yes, but the rest of it too, the way you'd make it for the most important guest who ever walked through that door. Because she is. He looked at Renee Mills. Ms. Mills, your shift is over. You're going to sit down at this table, with your daughter, and you are going to have the birthday dinner your little girl came here to give you. Own the house, and not as charity, but as the smallest possible down payment on what this restaurant owes you. Then he looked around at the staff frozen along the walls. And a full hot meal for everyone working tonight. No deductions. Nobody who works in my family's name goes home with less than they earned. That ends tonight. Renee Mills sat down slowly, as though she did not quite trust the chair to be real. Sora climbed up beside her and presented the crayon card with enormous ceremony, and Renee opened it, and inside, in the same painstaking letters, it read, "You are the best mommy and you work so hard and I love you." And Renee Mills put the card to her chest and bowed her head, and her shoulders shook, and her 7-year-old daughter patted her back and said, "Don't cry on your birthday, mommy, it's a happy day," which of course only made it worse, in the way that the purest things always do. Edward Hale looked away, to give them their moment, and found that he had to look away from quite a lot of things in himself as well. That night, he did not go home. He had Sal drive him to the family office, and he sat with the records of the Rosewood Grill spread across a conference table, and he read until the windows went from black to gray. What he found was not the work of one greedy manager. It was a structure. A careful, perfectly legal-looking structure of tip-outs and fees and charges, designed so that money flowed steadily upward from the people who earned it to the people who managed them, and every individual piece of it was small enough, and dressed in language reasonable enough, that no one had ever stood back and seen the whole grinding shape of it at once. Renee Mills had not been singled out. She was simply standing where the machine emptied its weight. The genius of it, Edward thought, turning page after page in the grey light, was that no single person in the whole long chain had ever had to feel like a thief. The manager who docked a check for a walkout was only enforcing policy. The executive who wrote the policy was only optimizing margins. The family office that approved the executive's plan was only reviewing a spreadsheet. And the owner who approved the family office, Edward himself, had only glanced at a summary over breakfast and turned the page. Each link in the chain had done one small, defensibly, bloodless thing. And at the far end of all those small bloodless things stood a 7-year-old in a yellow dress, holding a crayon card, asking a stranger for chicken. The cruelty had been distributed so evenly that it had become invisible, the way a great weight, spread across enough hands, feels like nothing to anyone holding it, except the person it is set down upon. He understood, finally, why his father had been able to live with all of it, and his father before him. They had never seen the whole shape either. They had been handed the summary and trusted it, generation after generation, and the trusting had felt like prudence rather than the abdication it was. Edward decided, somewhere in that grey hour, that the chain would stop with him. Not because he was better than the men who came before. Because a child had reached up and forced his eyes open, and unlike them, he no longer had the luxury of pretending he had not seen. Sal stayed with him, the way he had stayed for 20 years, except that now he sat at the table instead of waiting by the door, and Edward had asked him to, and that small change said more than either of them could have put into words. "You want to know the part that I can't get past," Edward said, somewhere near dawn. "It's not the money. It's the birthday. That child put on her best dress. She made a card. She came to a restaurant and asked a stranger for chicken so her mother could have one nice thing on the one day of the year that's supposed to be hers. And the reason she had to do that is that I, sitting in this very building once a month, took my cut so quietly and so legally that I never even felt it leave." Sal said nothing for a while. Then he said, "My wife worked tables for 30 years, reale. She passed 4 years ago. I never told you that either." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She used to come home some nights and cry about exactly this. The deductions. The walkouts. And I'd hold her, and I had no power to fix any of it, because I was just the driver." He looked at Edward. "You've got the power I never had. That's the whole difference between us. Not the money. The power to stop it. So stop it. For my Angela, who's gone, and for that little girl in the yellow dress, who isn't. Stop it and don't let it creep back." Edward Hale stopped it. It returned every dollar that had been taken in walkout charges, going back as far as the records ran, to every server it had been taken from, with interest, out of his own funds within the week. He abolished the walkout policy across every property the family owned, with a single line that he wrote himself: "No worker will ever again be charged for a theft committed against us." He ended the uniform fees, the training fees, the system fees, all of them. He restructured the tip out so that not 1 cent of any worker's tips could flow to a manager, and he brought in an outside firm to enforce it, because he had learned that you cannot trust the people who profit from a thing to guard against it. The executives who had built and maintained the structure were dismissed, including the head of the family's hospitality division, a man Edward had known socially for 30 years and who had described these operations to him at dinners and on golf courses as efficiencies. Edward did not spare him out of friendship. He had come to understand that the polite men in the good clubs, the ones who used words like efficiency and standard practice, were the architects of the whole thing, and that he himself had been their most useful client, the owner who asked no questions because the summaries came in clean. He went to see Renee and Zora a week later, on a Sunday afternoon, in their apartment at the back of a building 2 bus rides from the restaurant. He went without an appointment, and without his wallet, having learned somewhere in the last 7 days that what these people needed from him was not another envelope but his actual attention, the one currency he had spent his whole life refusing to spend. Zora answered the door, and her face lit up like a window at sunrise. Reale. Mami, it's the chicken man. She had clearly decided this was his name, and Edward decided he would happily answer to it for the rest of his life. The apartment was small and warm and full of the evidence of a child who was deeply loved on a very small budget. Drawings taped to the walls. A shelf of library books, well read. And on the refrigerator, in the place of honor, the crayon birthday card, displayed where it could be seen. Renee made tea, because she had no coffee, and apologized for it, and Edward told her, truthfully, that it was the best cup of tea he could remember, because it had been made for him by someone who owed him nothing and offered it anyway. I want to say something, Renee said, when they were seated. I'm grateful. I want you to know that, deeply. But I need you to understand something too. She glanced at her daughter, who was showing Sal a drawing in the corner. We were happy. Before all this. We were broke and we were tired, but we were happy. Zora is the joy of my entire life. I don't want you walking out of here thinking you found some sad little family and fixed us. You didn't. You found a family that was being robbed, and you stopped the robbery. That's all. That's enough. But don't make us your sad story, reale. We're nobody's sad story. We're a family, and we love each other, and now we'll just have a little more room to breathe. Edward, who had been given many things in his life and had earned the gratitude of many people, found that he had never been so thoroughly and so kindly put in his place. Mills, he said. I wouldn't dream of it. You're not a sad story. You're the reason I finally woke up. If anything, I'm yours. Zora came over then, holding up her drawing for him to see. It was a picture of a table, and around the table were stick figures, a tall one and a short one and, she had added, after some thought, a third with broad shoulders that was clearly meant to be Sal, and one with gray hair that was clearly meant to be Edward. Above the table she had written, in her careful capitals, birthday dinner. Everybody gets a big piece. Everybody gets a big piece, Edward read aloud. That's how it should be, Zora informed him. If there's enough. And there should always be enough, if people don't take more than they need. She frowned, working out a thought too big for her words. You had 2 whole pieces you weren't even going to eat. That's enough for 2 people right there. There is always enough. People just keep it from each other. Edward looked at the child, and then at Sal, and then at the drawing in his hands, and he thought that he had paid the finest consultants in the world a great deal of money over the years, and none of them had ever explained the economy of the human heart as clearly as a 7-year-old with a box of crayons. Before he left, Edward asked Zora if he could keep the drawing, the one with the birthday table where everybody got a big piece. She considered the request with the seriousness of a small business owner reviewing an offer, and then she made him a counter-proposal. You can keep it, she said, but you have to remember the rule. Everybody gets a big piece. If there's enough. And you said there's always enough, so. She left the conclusion hanging, the way children do when they have backed an adult into a corner of his own logic. Edward promised to remember the rule. A has kept that promise more faithfully than most of the contracts he ever signed, and the contracts he signed were worth a great deal more money and a great deal less. On the bus ride back to where Sal had parked, because Edward had insisted on taking the bus the family's properties, workers took, just once, to feel the length of it, he held the folded drawing carefully so it would not crease, and he watched the city go by at the speed of the people who could not afford to skip the stops. The changes held, because Edward made sure they held, and because Sal, who now sat in on the family office meetings as something between an advisor and a conscience, made sure Edward did not let them slide. He gathered the staff of the Rosewood Grill one morning before the doors opened, and he did the thing that men born into his kind of money are almost never willing to do. He stood before the people who served his family's tables and he told them the plain truth, in plain words, with none of the soft language the structure had hidden behind. He told them what had been taken, and how, and for how long, and he said the ugly words out loud, robbery and theft, where the polite men had always said efficiency and policy. He did not ask to be forgiven, and he did not ask to be thanked. A man does not get thanked for returning what was stolen, he said, and I would be suspicious of myself if I expected it. He told them what would change, and then, in the long unglamorous year that followed, he proved it, which is the only proof that has ever mattered. The silver-haired waiter, the one who had once done the math on his tip-out and wished he hadn't, asked the question every one of them was thinking. And when the news cameras lose interest, he said, and the lawyers go home, and nobody's watching anymore. What then? Edward looked at him and said, then you watch me. That's the only honest answer I can give you. Not my promises. My record. Hold me to it for the rest of my life. The waiter held him to it. And the year on, when the walkout charges were still gone and the tips still came whole, the old man simply nodded at Edward across the dining room one evening, a small private nod between two men, and that nod meant more to Edward than any award his family's money had ever purchased. Edward established a fund that any worker across the family's properties could draw on in a hard month, with no manager to convince and no shame to swallow. He created a policy, only half in jest, that every employee was entitled to their birthday off, paid, because a 7-year-old had taught him that birthdays should be nice even if they don't pay the rent, and he had decided she was right. He did not single Zora out for special treatment, because Renee Mills had made it abundantly clear she would not accept being anyone's charity case. But he kept a quiet eye on them, the way you watch over people who have changed your life without meaning to. Renee, it turned out, had a head for organization that 2 years of waiting tables had hidden, and within a year she was running the floor at the Rosewood Grill, and within 2 she was managing it, and she ran it as a place where no server ever paid for a walkout and every birthday was honored, and the staff would have walked through fire for her. A year after the night Zora gave her mother a birthday dinner of borrowed chicken, Edward Hale returned to the Rosewood Grill. The dark wood was the same, the fire, the soft leather. But the people who worked there moved like people who were no longer being quietly bled, and you could feel the difference the moment you walked in, even if you could not have named it. Zora was 8 now, and a little taller, and she came to the restaurant after school and did her homework in a corner booth while the cooks tested her on her spelling and slipped her dessert. She found Edward at his usual table and walked up with the easy ownership of a child who has been told, in 100 small ways, that she belongs in a room. She was carrying a small paper bag. And, Edward noticed, a folded sheet of paper. It's not your birthday, she announced. I checked. He asked Mommy. But I made you something. Anyway. He opened the bag. Inside were 2 pieces of fried chicken, wrapped carefully in foil. And she handed him the folded paper, and he opened it, and it was a card, crayon, decorated with hearts, and across the front, in capitals that were noticeably neater than they had been a year ago, it said, "Thank you for looking." Edward Hale stared at the 3 words for a long time. "For looking," he said quietly. "Mommy explained it to me," Zora said. "She said before, you didn't see us, and then you did, and that everything changed because you decided to look." She considered him with her clear, serious eyes. "So I made you a thank you card. For looking. It's the most important thing you did. Anybody can give people money. Mommy says lots of rich people give money so they don't have to look. But you looked first. That's the part that counts." Edward Hale, who had inherited a fortune and a habit of blindness and had spent 65 years believing the first was the valuable one, sat in his family's restaurant holding a crayon card from a child, and understood at last which inheritance had been the curse. "You take the big piece tonight," he told her. "Both of them, actually. Take them home. It's not anyone's birthday, but a person doesn't need a birthday to have something nice. You should have learned that a long time ago. You taught it to me in a week." Zora beamed, and took the bag, and went back to her homework, and Edward sat with the thank you card in his hands while Sal, across the table, pretended very hard to be reading the wine list. "You all right, Amy Reale?" Sal asked, not looking up. "She thanked me for looking," Edward said. "Sal, she thanked me for the one thing that should never have needed doing. For noticing she existed. For seeing her mother. A child wrote me a card to thank me for the bare minimum of being a human being, and she meant it, because in her experience the bare minimum is rare enough to be worth a card." He set the paper down gently on the table, where the firelight caught it. "I have spent my whole life being thanked for my generosity. For checks I never felt and buildings with my name on them. This is the first thank you I've ever received that I'm not sure I earned. And it's the only one I'll keep." Sal finally set down the wine list. "My Angela would have liked that kid," he said. "She'd have liked who you turned into, though. Took you long enough. There was no cruelty in it. After 20 years, it was the closest thing to affection the old man had." Edward took it as exactly that. He kept the card. He had it framed, eventually, and he hung it in his office, between a portrait of his grandfather and a window that looked out over the city, where every visitor could see it. 3 crayon words. "Thank you for looking." People assumed it was sentimental. It was not. It was an instruction. He had hung it where he would have to read it every morning, so that he would never again be allowed to forget the one thing it had taken him a lifetime, and a 7-year-old, to learn. Here is the part worth carrying out of the room with you. A child asked a rich man for 2 pieces of chicken, and the reason was not simple hunger, though hunger was certainly in it. The reason was love. It was a 7-year-old's birthday, except the birthday belonged to her mother, and the only gift the child could think to give the person she loved most was a fancy dinner made of a stranger's leftovers, served with a crayon card. That was the thing that shocked him. Not the asking. The reason behind the asking. A love so large, and so resourceful, that a small girl in a faded yellow dress had found a way to celebrate her exhausted mother using nothing but what the comfortable were about to throw away. And the lesson belonged not to the child, nor even to her mother, but to the man at the head of the table. Edward Hale learned that you can be cruel without ever doing a single cruel thing yourself, simply by inheriting a machine and declining to look inside it. He learned that the gentlest words, efficiency, standard practice, tip out, are often the costume that theft wears in respectable rooms. He learned that a man can give generously to the world with one hand while quietly taking, through structures he never examined, from the very people who serve him. And he learned, from a 7-year-old and an old driver who had kept his peace for 20 years, that not looking is itself a choice, and that the powerful are responsible not only for the harm they cause but for the harm they decline to see. Real compassion is the harder thing. It is looking when looking is uncomfortable. It is asking where the clean summary came from and who paid for it. It is refusing to be the owner who asks no questions because the numbers arrive tidy. It is making certain that no mother has to work through her own birthday for wages that have been quietly bled away, and that no child has to give the gift of a borrowed dinner because a fair one was stolen from her family a deduction at a time. Sometimes justice does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in a faded yellow party dress, holding a crayon card that says "Happy Birthday Mommy," asking a stranger for the food on his plate. And sometimes all it takes is one person at the head of the table, finally willing to set down his fork, and look, and keep looking, long after the comfortable thing would be to look away. This story is a work of fiction. All characters and events are imagined, and any resemblance to real people or actual events is entirely coincidental. It is offered only as a story, and as a quiet reminder that the way we treat the people who serve us, and the children who love them, may be the truest measure of who we really are.